Thank you. My favourite thing about presenting in France is that you call a presentation an intervention, which makes me feel much more significant. So I was asked to come and talk in general terms about privacy. What do we think privacy is? What do we think is happening? What might change? And so I thought it might be useful to start with this, which was an editorial or a polemic written by the chief executive of Axel Springer. Europe should take private data back. Big companies shouldn't have our data. There's some interesting things about this piece. One of them was the claim that no company should have your private data, which made me wonder how a bank is supposed to function if it doesn't know how much money I have, or indeed a phone company if it doesn't know who I make phone calls to. But a more interesting thing I thought was that he published this on a website called Business Insider, which Axel Springer owns. And so the website in which Axel Springer says nobody should collect private data is run by Axel Springer and has 61 trackers collecting your private data. So this question of privacy might be a little bit complicated. This is, of course, what those 61 trackers are doing. This is a famous study done by PwC in 2019. They tried to work out where the money goes when an advertiser places budget, and they found that not only did only about 50% go to publishers, but they actually couldn't trace 15% of it. Now, maybe this just tells us that you shouldn't get PwC to do your audit, because they might not be able to find the money. But I think it speaks to, a general point that advertising, online advertising, was built up as a sort of vast inverted pyramid with hundreds of different companies shuffling information around, and with no one really understanding how it worked. I often used to say when I worked in Silicon Valley that nobody in technology that doesn't actually work in advertising knows anything about it or understands how it works, and even most people who work in advertising don't really understand how it works. There's a famous line from the 19th century that only 3 people have ever understood the Schleswig-Holstein question. One of them went mad, one of them is dead, and the other has forgotten. And I think that might be a good way of describing cookies 25 years on. And so I think, as we all know, we now have this thing called the cookie apocalypse, and so a combination of regulatory decisions from the EU, California, the UK, and other places, on the one hand, and policy platform decisions by Apple and Google are limiting, turning off, massively reducing the role of cookies. And this is all being done in the name of privacy, which all sounds very good, except we don't actually know what happens next. This is one thing that might happen next. This is the San Francisco Chronicle when you first arrive on the website. I don't think anybody believes that this is a good outcome. This is what happens if you say you have to ask for permission for every cookie and everything that you're doing. On the other hand, this is another outcome. This is Apple's permission screen for Apple to show its own advertising. Now, I did actually study French when I was a child, although obviously I've forgotten most of it. But I do remember learning grammar, and there is this concept of the irregular verb. And so here we have a new irregular verb. I personalize advertising, you track your users, and they violate fundamental human rights. It depends entirely on who's doing it, it seems. And if you actually look at Apple's statement here, we have a very a very clear statement. Apple doesn't track you, it just does all of these things that sound a lot like tracking to me. We record your purchases, we look at your activity, we analyze your behavior, we use that to show you ads, but that's not tracking because it's only tracking when other people do it. Incidentally, this is the head of Instagram replying to this, saying he would actually be very happy if he could if Apple would allow him to use the language that Apple uses for its own products. So there's clearly some kind of interesting complexity in what we mean when we say privacy or tracking. If we don't resolve those questions, then we have the potential for what you might call a winner-takes-all or winner-takes-most outcome. So companies that have lots of their own data, lots of their own first-party data, most obviously Google, but also Facebook or indeed Amazon, can target inside their own systems because somehow that doesn't count as a privacy question. Equally large publishers, the New York Times, the Guardian, that have huge amounts of their own internal traffic, can track and analyze and target advertising based on that. But smaller third-party players that historically have been dependent on aggregating this information across different places might make much less money. So one outcome is this is bad for small publishers. Another outcome, incidentally, is to think a little bit about why Amazon was on that chart. And I'm glad we had the guys from Amazon earlier describing their product in detail. It's a research report from Goldman Sachs pointing out this phrase merchant media, which means e-commerce sites offering advertising inventory, has now become a huge topic of conversation in e-commerce. And this is what the guys from Amazon were actually talking about. Hidden in the back of Amazon's account, there is a line called Other Revenue, which is described as predominantly advertising. That's what it's done in the last couple of years. Now, over 30 billion euros, so probably 25 billion euros of advertising, probably producing more cash flow than AWS, if not last year, then this year, maybe next year. And hidden in the back of the account is called Other. Just as a fun comparison, that's roughly equivalent to the entire global advertising revenue of the global newspaper industry, certainly more than the global magazine industry. And you kind of know what the history of these charts would look like if I were to run them back. So we have these sort of questions. Do we just turn all of this off? Or are there ways that we can sort of reconcile the underlying business purpose with a conception of privacy? And so historically, we've had this vast information kind of tracking and vast industry tracking and collating all of our information. But that isn't sort of inherent to the economic purpose, because the economic purpose of advertising is that Procter & Gamble wants to show ads for nappies to people who have babies, and not show them to people who don't have babies, and have some idea of which ads worked. And it doesn't actually want to know anything about you individually at all. It just wants to know that it showed 100,000 ads to people who had babies, and hopefully not to people who don't have babies. And so this gets us to a question, like in principle, it ought to be possible to achieve almost all of the underlying business purposes without getting into problems of privacy. There's a great phrase here from Tim O'Reilly, technology publisher, that data is not oil, data is sand. That we, all of us, think of our own private data as having enormous value and enormous economic value, and some people get very upset when they hear that some company they've never heard of might have access to it. But if you're Procter & Gamble, you don't care about that information at all. Data is sand. It has value only in the aggregate of millions or hundreds of millions of individual pieces. And each grain of sand by itself is worth nothing. So we ought to be able to aggregate that without violating people's privacy. The challenge there is we don't really agree on what we mean by privacy. So Apple tracks you on the device, Google tracks you in the cloud. Which of those is more private? An ad network tracks you across the internet and records what you read. The Guardian or the New York Times track you across their website and record what you read. Why is one of those private and the other one not private? Do we have any kind of clear Cartesian sense of what privacy means in these discussions? And meanwhile, as consumers, I think we're conflicted. Because on the one hand, if we see an ad that's clearly nothing to do with us, we say, well, this is crap, I don't want to see ads like that. But then if you see an ad that's too much about you, then you feel uncomfortable. So we want advertising that's personal but not too personal, but we don't quite know what that means either. Now, I've mentioned Apple a couple of times. It's important to understand even Apple gets confused here. So earlier this year, Apple launched a project to scan images, photographs that you had taken that are being uploaded to iCloud against a database of known child sex abuse material. And this is something that Facebook and Google and Microsoft have been doing for 10 years. Except that Apple decided that if they were to scan in the cloud, that would be violating your privacy. And so instead, they would scan the device on your phone when it was uploaded to iCloud. And they thought this is perfect because now we're scanning for images of children being abused, but we're not violating your privacy because we're not doing it in the cloud. But the problem is there's then an enormous backlash because everybody else says if you're scanning my pictures on my phone, then you are violating my privacy. So Apple has this very clear idea that if it's on the device, it's private, and discovered that actually not everybody agrees with that. Another question, and this comes to the first-party data conversation, parts of the ad tech industry have established a very clear thesis that it's only tracking if it's happening across different websites. And if it's first-party data, that's not tracking. So I have 350,000 Twitter followers, and they mostly work in technology. And so I asked this poll. This is a self-selected poll, but it's a poll of people who work in technology and are interested in these questions. Is first-party data tracking? If the New York Times tracks your information for a month and uses that to target advertising, is that tracking? Well, 83% of people kind of thought yes. And I'm not going to argue about whether this is right or wrong. I'm simply pointing out that if we're going to try and construct a theory of advertising or a theory of targeting or tracking that is private, your ideas of what constitute private might not be other people's ideas of what constitute private. That was the problem that Apple ran into. It's the problem that I'm afraid first-party data might run into. If people suddenly realize that the New York Times records everything you read for a year and uses that to target advertising, they might not say, oh, that's first-party data, so that's okay. They might say this is a violation of my privacy, and that would be kind of a problem for the New York Times' advertising business. Meanwhile, it's worth just kind of stepping back and talking about the broader question. So far, I've mostly talked about advertising. So this is American advertising as a share of GDP back since about 1950. There's a lot of interesting things happening in this chart. In fact, originally I made this chart because I wanted to know what happened to radio advertising when TV appeared. And so you can see that down at the bottom left here. The answer is radio advertising declined by about a third in reaction to TV. But there's other things happening here. One of them is that print advertising has been declining as a share of GDP since 1950. Another of them is, as we all know, internet advertising has effectively replaced print advertising in budgets. More interesting, I think, here is that the top line has declined. So advertising has declined by about a third as a share of GDP since 2000. And there's a lot of interesting things going on within that. Part of that is recategorization. So the car dealer that would have bought a 20-page insert in a newspaper and is now paying to run their own website and buying one search ad on Google, they may have the same budget, but it's no longer called advertising. It may no longer even be called marketing. Another, of course, is that Google and Facebook have been massively deflationary to ad pricing. They offered an entirely new product that was orders of magnitude cheaper. But I think the deeper point here is that advertisers and marketers and brands are sort of fundamentally rethinking where they would put their money and how they think about ROI. And the more that we change the ROI on advertising, of course, the more that money simply moves into different places with kind of consequences for some things on this chart that we might care about. But if we take a step back another level, what do we think we're trying to do here? There's an old phrase in the technology industry that a computer should never ask a question if it should be able to work out the answer. And when this was said in about 1990, the kind of questions that people were thinking about were questions like, what kind of printer do I have? Or what kind of screen do I have? Or do I have sound? And then we shift to new levels of abstraction. So we get to questions like, do I want to turn my computer off? What network am I connected to? We get an iPhone, and an iPhone shifts the level of abstraction. The iPhone doesn't ask you what your network is, or do you want to turn it off, or where do you save the file, or what file system you're using. Do you have a sound card? An iPhone removes a whole layer of questions that we had to understand. Now, we are now, I'm afraid, thinking again about more layers of abstraction. So if I go to Google and say, this is an example that Google used to use a lot. If I go to Google and search for Taj Mahal, what am I asking? Now, it might be that I am sitting in a school on a Wednesday morning and I Google Taj Mahal, and the answer is I probably want the mausoleum in Agra. On the other hand, if I am in East London and it's 8 o'clock on a Friday night and I Google Taj Mahal, I might want to know about the mausoleum, but it's more likely that I'm looking for a curry restaurant that's 200 yards away from me. And so there's a whole sort of generalized conversation around how much computing platforms understand us, how much they know, how much they can understand what we might want or what we might be interested in. This, after all, is the fundamental question in advertising. How do I know about something? How might I know what I might like to buy? And the more that computing becomes a sort of integral part of our lives, the more important it becomes for those systems to try and understand us more and more. This, I think, is a good illustration of what I mean when I say that these systems become part of our lives. This is a chart of online dating in the USA. So in each year, what percentage of relationships began online? By 2017, 40% of all new relationships in the USA began online, began in an app. This is incidentally heterosexual relationships. For homosexual relationships, it's about 90% because you have a very different kind of pooling problem. I hope in 2020 it was 100% and nobody was dating in person, but we will see. And what charts like this, I think, say is that more and more we expect computers to know, we expect computers to understand, we expect computers to accumulate some sort of understanding of what it is that we might want and what we might be interested in. And the more that we build products like that and expect products to be able to do that, the more we have a privacy question. Because what does it mean for Instagram or Google or Amazon to have some sense of what I might be interested in? Is that a privacy question? What kind of privacy question? How might we expand the use of that data? There was a great Dilbert cartoon that occurred to me as I was waiting to speak from sort of 15 years ago, where a character says, "I'm a vegan, I don't consume nothing that has any connection with animal products." And Dilbert says, "Your clothes are woven on machines powered by electricity that comes from dead dinosaurs." And so we have this question, well, how far do we take privacy? What are we trying to achieve with privacy? What kind of products do we want? And how do we reconcile that with a conception of privacy? I think another really good example of some of the challenges that we face is to think specifically about Instagram, which I mentioned earlier. Supposing instead of saying that we want to create privacy, instead we said, well, we're going to regulate Instagram. Well, there isn't one regulator that applies to Instagram, there are two, because the privacy regulator will say you must minimize your data collection, you must make it as difficult as possible to export data. The competition regulator must say you have to make it as easy as possible to export data to as many different companies as possible, because that's how you would be able to compete with those other, that's how you would be able to build a new competitor to Instagram. I've had this conversation with a major competition regulator in Europe who said, I go to a company and says, you must do this. And the company goes across the road to the privacy regulator who says, you must not do that. And the company says, well, I can do either of those, but you're going to need to decide which. You need to get into a room, because I can't do both. And I think this is a sort of a generalized question as we look at what privacy means in a world in which all of our data might be on a computer. How does that conflict with other kinds of questions? Another really interesting topic that's come up in broader regulatory circles is algorithmic bias. So suppose, very obvious example, you have a credit card scoring system that uses machine learning, and it's biased against people with particular ethnic backgrounds. Meanwhile, your privacy system means you're not allowed to collect people's ethnic backgrounds, so you don't know. In fact, you literally do not have the data that would allow you to analyze the way your system is behaving to work out whether it's biased or not. The system has inferred different credit ratings for people in different parts of the city, but you aren't able to analyze it because you haven't collected that data. So we have all sorts of really interesting conflicts and questions and puzzles and paradoxes, not just in how we understand privacy, but also in how we trade that off against other objectives. In a sense, this is, I think, how policy works. This is a set of books that were written in the late 1970s and early 80s. If you're an aficionado of typography, you will immediately be able to tell when these books were published. They all look very late 70s, early 80s. And these books are all written about databases. And there was a period in time when people looked at databases and thought this is a threat to democracy, this is a threat to civilization, because suddenly things that were sort of theoretically possible at a very small scale become practically possible at a massive scale. In fact, there's a wonderful story I saw in a novel by Simenon, written in the 1930s, where the French detective Maigret, scares a witness. And then he goes across the road to a cafe and he calls the telephone exchange. And he says, somebody's going to make a long-distance phone call from this nightclub. Hold the call and wait till I get there so I can listen to the call. And then he gets a taxi to the telephone exchange and then listens into that phone call as it's being made. Now, today, that's a computer, and you could listen to every phone call being made in Paris, at least theoretically. And so what worries people is that you take something that was sort of theoretically possible and you scale it so that it becomes universal. That was the concern that we had with databases. It's the kind of the concern that we have today with something like with privacy. It's a concern we have with questions like face recognition, that when you bring in automation, when you bring in computers, this is an IBM 360, which was released in 1965, all sorts of arguments change. Now, in a sense, this has always been part of the process of absorbing new technology. So every new technology that has been deployed that's changed the world becomes regulated. So we regulate railways, we regulate the food industry, there are laws on what you can put into food, we regulate aircraft, we regulate cars, now we regulate the internet. But if we think about what it means to say that we regulate cars, that's not really true, because we regulate 10, 15, 20 different questions. And so safety or emissions are quite different questions to parking or congestion. And you can go to General Motors and tell them that they have to put seatbelts in the car, but you can't tell them that they have to stop teenage boys from getting drunk and driving too fast, nor can you tell them to build cycle lanes. This is a set of images from, I think, Amsterdam, 50 years apart, so sort of 1920, 1960, and then sort of sometime today. This is a set of decisions around urban planning and taxation. These are not really engineering decisions. They're also not really technology decisions. These are decisions about what kind of a society you want to live in. They're also not, incidentally, antitrust conversations. Decisions about how you want to run your society that are embedded in all sorts of different puzzles and paradoxes and trade-offs. This won't, incidentally, get any easier. We now clearly are moving to a world in which face recognition will be easy and ubiquitous. There's a fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal last week talking to people from the CIA saying that ubiquitous video cameras in capitals of the developed world has fundamentally changed how they do their job. Because it used to be that you could just kind of walk around London or Paris or Berlin, and unless there was actually 20 people in cars following you, nobody would know where you'd gone. But today there are a whole bunch of cities in what they call adversarial countries where they've realized that their operatives are not being followed anymore because you don't need to follow them. If a CIA agent leaves the American embassy in Beijing, the Chinese don't need to follow that agent around Beijing in person. They can just watch that agent wherever he goes, anywhere in the city, with a combination of digital cameras and, of course, face recognition. And so none of this is going to get simpler. All of this is going to get more complex and more difficult. That gets us, I think, to a kind of what we call the policy triad, which is you can have two of these. So you can make the product better, you can have more competition, and you can have more privacy and security. But you probably can't have all three of these. So you can make an Instagram competitor in which it is easy to export data, but that's bad for privacy. You can make an Instagram competitor in which it's hard to export data, but that's bad for competition. You can make a product in which you can export data with lots of privacy restrictions, but then that becomes a very chaotic and confusing product, and it's hard to use. You almost certainly can't have all three of these. This is kind of a generalized engineering problem. People talked about this in the aircraft industry. Better, faster, cheaper, pick two, because you can't have all three of them. Now, one way to look at this would be to say technology policy is hard. And very often people in the technology industry have a tendency to say, you're all idiots, you don't understand this, I will explain how this works, you should just shut up and do what I say. And so it feels like special pleading. The challenge is actually that's not specific to technology, this is just how policy works. That actually all policy is hard, all policy is complicated, and technology policy is not any more difficult, any more complex than education or healthcare or transport or energy. These are all complicated questions that are full of kind of complicated trade-offs. This is a cartoon from perhaps the first regulation panic. This was an episode in America at the beginning of the 20th century when people suddenly discovered what happened in slaughterhouses. And they suddenly discovered that when they bought the sausage that had come from the industrial slaughterhouse in Chicago, it might contain pork. There was probably some pork in it. That pork had probably been in a warehouse for 18 months and then sprayed with bleach and dye and ammonia. And it probably contained quite a lot of rat as well. Indeed, it might contain more rat than pork. And Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle talking about this, and there's a story that the president, Theodore Roosevelt, was actually reading this book over breakfast and he took a sausage out of his mouth and threw it out of the window. And so this prompted the creation of the FDA. It prompted all sorts of regulations around veterinary care and around regulations on food hygiene, and so on. But we still have slaughterhouses. And so part of the conversation we're going through now is we sort of suddenly realize that there's this internet thing. And we've suddenly realized that there is online advertising, there is cookies, there is all sorts of information. We're kind of trying to work out, well, yes, but what do we do? What would an appropriate reaction to that be? And what is it that we want to achieve as an endpoint from all of that? And so with that, I think I will say thank you.